topic today is going to be comparing more than two groups. We spent lots of time earlier in this class talking about how to compare two groups to each other. We talked about t-tests. We talked about non-parametric alternatives to t-tests. The thing is, when you compare, say, two populations and you're interested in how different their means are, you take the difference, right? You take one number and you subtract the other number. That's what we do to see how far apart two numbers are. But what do you do when you have three numbers? You can't subtract three numbers. So if you're interested in whether three numbers are different from each other, suddenly that's a much more difficult problem. And that's the problem we'll be talking about here. So we can't compare more than two groups until we come up with some kind of test statistic. Again, because it can't just be x bar minus y bar if you also have a z bar. So we need a test statistic, something we can calculate from the data to help us understand how far apart three groups are if we want to be able to run hypothesis tests. The example that we're going to use to motivate this is the Spock example. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, and then I'm going to have you look at a graphic and skim through a couple links that I'll also post. Dr. Spock was a pediatrician in the 1950s or 60s or so. And he was very, very famous and popular. He wasn't just a pediatrician in one town. He wrote books about how to raise children that were read by families all across America. So he's a very, very famous guy. It also turned out that he was a very political guy. And so when the Vietnam War came around and all of the young men who his books had helped raise were drafted into Vietnam, he was very active politically in his opposition to that draft. And in fact, he was arrested for allegedly trying to impede the draft, trying to prevent young men from following the law and actually being drafted. So that's the context, that's the court case. And so his trial happened in Boston, and there are seven judges in Boston. This is based on this slide. So trial in Boston. Okay, and there are 7 judges of this particular kind of court in Boston. And the question here is whether the judge that Spock was assigned was doing anything different than he should have, than might have happened if Spock had a different judge in his trial. So in particular, we want to talk about the way that juries are chosen for these courts. So I'm going to use a word called veneer. Okay, veneers. So here's how it works. According to the law, any person who's eligible to be on a jury is just on a big list. The list of people who are eligible to be on Boston juries, so people living around Boston. And people are randomly chosen, so supposedly by simple random sample from that list to be on veneers for each court case. So a new court case comes around, somebody randomly samples, I think 50 people from all possible jurors, and that's the veneer for the particular case. So we can call the veneers, a veneer is a set of possible jurors for a case. Now, once you have the possible jurors from a case that are randomly sampled, then once the case begins in court, the lawyers spend a lot of time disqualifying certain people and asking those people questions, and each lawyer is allowed to roll out a whole bunch of different jurors. They look for conflicts of interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the people who eventually end up on the jury are not a random sample from the veneer, but the veneer itself, the panel of people who are potential jurors from a case, is supposed to be representative of all eligible jurors in that area. So there are 7 judges in Boston at that time, and I want you now to take a look at the box plot that I've posted, a set of box plots, which shows for a bunch of cases for each of these judges what proportion of women was on each of those veneers.